Hi, Benji.
Hey Van, how's it going? Hi Tim.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yourself?
Doing all right.
You said you've managed to catch up a little bit on the various discussions around this, yeah?
Yeah, I believe so. Uh, yeah, I was reading through the notes from the various meetings and the sort of summary issue and things like that.
Hmm.
Lot of progress since I last was involved.
There's certainly been a lot of discussions indeed. Lee's just mentioned that you might be a couple of minutes late. Whew. How's everyone's day been so far? Not long for some of you.
Pretty good. I just noticed is your shirt like a background?
Oh yeah.
It's pretty awesome.
It's like those cartoons you had when you were kids.
Yeah.
And like they'd have all the little cutout dudes and the pattern would stay fixed whilst the character moved. I like it. I just fiddle around with my video software from time to time.
I was going to say that's not a standard Zoom feature.
No.
Cool.
All right. Well, Leo will join us shortly, I'm sure. In the meantime, haven't got exactly an agenda per se about this call. It's more of a case of catching up on where we are and evaluating some of the various questions that have cropped up, seeing where that puts us, and whether continuing with the tag type is the right direction, and if so, there's some decisions to be made there, or whether one of the alternative solutions is actually better placed. And I think the main thing that is going to control or going to influence what direction we take here is answering the question of whether the tag type should also be valid for output as well as input. that seems to be the most controversial thing about it. But also, for me, if it's not on output, that's a perfectly acceptable decision. But at that point, I'm not certain that it is the right decision to go with the tag type, because I think some of its advantage is that it has a mirror. And if we decide that we don't need that side of things, it might be better to go with a different solution that may be more analogous to the existing types that we have, such as Tim's original proposal, for example, revisiting that, seeing how we can address the shortcomings in it, and so on. Hello, Lee.
Hey, friends.
How's it going?
Going well. Sorry for joining a couple minutes late.
No worries.
We got a solid crew here today.
That we do. So I was just saying, I think that the main outcome from this call is like basically to figure out what the next steps are, because there's some decisions that need making, which may influence which direction we go from here. Like if we decide to continue with the tag type, what that actually ends up being, because there is open discussion points on it. And depending on what decisions we make there, whether or not the tag type is actually the right type for us to continue ahead on. Before we dig into that, I just wanted to know if anyone's thought more deeply about the input unions problem and has any new stuff that they want to bring, or anything that they want to any use cases they've come up with, or anything they want to reiterate before we continue.
I kind of have a new proposal. I thought about it for last 2 months, and I have like a new idea. It's like I could create a short presentation about it. It's variation on tag union, but like with different spin. So I'm not sure about the order. Should we discuss it like before?
Yeah, absolutely. New information first, I think, because then we can evaluate all the existing information against the new information.
Okay, so what I didn't fully finish it, but yeah, like I drafted the proposal. So what? One. Yeah, so I will show my entire desktop. Oh, wait a second. Sharing. Yeah, and desktop. Yeah, you should see slides, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's go to first one. So I coded mutually exclusive fields, XOR fields, because of syntax. So idea is to mark not like tag union, but some protocols like protobuf have a concept of one-off. So you have a group of mutually exclusive fields. Even Captain Proto have like groups of mutually exclusive fields. They use a little bit different syntax with one-off and like curly braces, but I choose that one and I will explain why. So idea here is like you add XOR symbol and you basically XORing with fields. So it's valid only if only one field is present. So if no fields are present, it's invalid. If like more than one field is present, it's invalid. So exactly one field. So in that case, it's similar to one-off proposal, but it's allow you to add like additional fields. It's only one group, so it doesn't support like two groups of mutually exclusive fields or nested groups of mutually exclusive fields. It's like just one layer on top. That's why with syntax, because like mutually exclusive it's XOR basically in most of the languages. So you can also apply it to args, and I think it's important to keep feature parity between input fields and args, because we don't want to force people to wrap stuff into input objects just to have like better validation, create like one layer of nesting just for that purpose. I think it's actually important. That's why like with syntax, with like source symbol, because you can apply it to args basically. So additional benefit, you can migrate from, imagine you had some like type and it wasn't polymorphic, so it was like some specific stuff, and you want to make it polymorphic. In this case, you can keep like old fields, you just make them optional and mark as deprecated and just add mutually exclusive fields. So migration from fixed input to polymorphic became like easier. And solution, yeah, there is another problem we recently introduced. We recently add support for deprecated directive on args. And one of the drawbacks was that we don't allow people to deprecate required arguments, because like you cannot remove required args from your query. But if we allow mutually exclusive fields, basically can say like you should use this required args and you should provide one of them. So you basically force people to switch to new arg in the query. But it's byproduct, it's not the main purpose, it's just like something to additional benefit solution. So since we discussed output types, I'm personally not sure that we need it, but if we want like a full parity, we can add it to output types. Even like I'm like totally not sure if we should do that or not, but even on the interface, it will complicate rules of inheritance, but like if we decide it's worth, we can do it. Personally, I'm on the fence about that one, but just for the sake of comparing different proposals. Additional benefits that, for example, in case of mutation payloads, you need to provide client ID and data and error. And you're not duplicating client ID, you're not creating like a union type or something. So it's like you can have common part and mutually exclusive part at the same type. Restriction. So I thought about that, and one of things that I think is important is to say that mutually exclusive fields should, in SDL form, they should be at the end always, because if you mix them, it looks like you have two different groups, or like more than one group of mutually exclusive field, which is confusing. So in grammar, we can restrict mutually exclusive fields to be at the end. And another thing, like default values don't make sense for mutually exclusive fields. So we can also forbid it inside grammar. I wanted to add like one more slide before this meeting, but I didn't finish in time. Idea that implementation should be pretty easy. We just add a Boolean flag for IST and for introspection, say mutually exclusive or something similar is mutually exclusive. And that's basically all, and change like validation rules. So from implementation standpoint, it's pretty easy. It's even simpler than directive. Like the hardest part is to figure out the grammar and change parser. Yeah, any thoughts or suggestions?
So I think it's interesting. It has sparked a few ideas for me. One place where my mind went was the addition of a new syntax is a little tricky. And so I kind of went down the line of like, what could we do with the directive? So maybe the one of directive could be put on individual fields with a group argument name, and that would let you identify the group, kind of name it, and you're not adding any new parser syntax. And so then I was kind of thinking like, what if you could do it a one of on the input definition itself, and then it's one of the whole thing, or you could use it as one of on individual fields to make a mutually exclusive group within the input type.
So
It does all the same things. It just doesn't do it via a new syntax. It just leverages the directives to do it instead.
couple point about groups. I'm totally against like allowing more than one. So Benji had this discussion in one of the issue about directive, and it's like it's complicated after completion. It's complicated UI. It's like complicate error messages. As for using directive instead of XOR, yeah, we can go with that route. I just think like it's not like a big addition to a syntax. It's not most valuable symbol. Like one thing we need always to consider is like how many not used symbols we still have, but I don't think like it's like most used syntax, most used like symbol in programming languages. So I'm against groups, more than one group, but I'm okay with like directive on the field if we decide it's better.
I'm with you on groups. I feel like groups are also really easy to emulate via nesting, right? Like you could imagine, Vince, in your example, you could have a species field that then is yet another sub-selection of cat or dog. So it's like, slightly not ideal to create the nesting, but the win is that you have a slightly simpler type model. So yeah,
then we could just consider, instead of the sort of caret operator, just you could stick the one of directive on all the fields that you want it to apply to, rather than. I think that the change here, the idea here is that a subset of the fields could be the one of. I think that's the big thing. Syntax, a different story.
One thing about the syntax, one thing I want to say, I did like a survey in my company. So I took two random persons. Actually, I met two people in the kitchen, and I showed them the syntax. And one of them actually figured out, and I asked them to write JSON for input value, like query variable for iPad. And one of them like totally figured it out, even like figured out why. Another guy said he figured like half of the thing. He said like, I understand it's mutually exclusive, but I don't understand why, and I don't understand how to specify it. So I would say it's not success, but somehow it's like it's intuitive for like, even for people who never saw syntax or never read about it. Yeah, sorry, Andy, I interrupted. Just wanted to say about this.
By the way, Ivan, I have a hard time understanding you. Like your audio was really, maybe it's my problem, but your audio was very low. Just as a high level, like my high level impression here, or like my train of thought goes a little bit like this. there's a spectrum of constraints you want to apply to input fields, output fields, and kind of elements of the type systems are the most static, most restrictive way how to express constraints. Like if you say something needs to be non-null, you can express it actually as part of the type system. And it's like the most clear, the most well communicated. It's part of the language and so on. But there's like the spectrum goes on. There's like a lot of aspects which you can't express in the type system. Like most famously, something I'm running into often is you can say a list does not contain null elements, but you can't express a list is not allowed to be empty. Like so you can't do it. You need to actually apply runtime validation to it, which is a constraint. You can't communicate it, you can't express in the type system, but it's still a constraint. So it's still on the spectrum. And for me, the whole discussion about input unit kind of feels so far, after reading the docs like last year, the group came up with, which was really, really helpful and great. It feels a lot like, okay, you want to apply, or we want to apply a constraint which says fundamentally only one of n fields is allowed as input. Can I get a confirmation if this is like the fundamental constraint we are looking for? And because this is for me like the core problem of what I understand, and how you would express this constraint via syntax in one different way, via a specific type, is a little bit like a second discussion maybe. So this is like my first. So I liked Ivan's idea, and it kind of mirrors my understanding of the problem, which is fundamentally you want to express this constraint of multiple fields, but only one is allowed.
I think even that though is a bit of a subset of the issue. It's really just input polymorphism, right? Like it's not necessarily fields that we want to select one of. It's that we want to provide the ability to have variable input types for a given input.
Yeah, this is a different goal than multiple input fields, because if you say you want different types, you say you want to have this constraint expressed in the type system as polymorphism. Like that's a different goal, which is maybe valid. I'm just calling out the system.
In the simple pet, I want to be able to express like the species of the pet. And so like, I want to be able to say, put a new pet in my registry, and for a cat, do it with these set of properties, and for a dog, do it with these set of properties. And I want to be able to express that in the type system without just having two different mutations, for example.
So, and would you be able to do this in Ivan's proposal, for example? Because you could say one is cat, one is dog, this would be enough? Or not? Because it would not.
It would solve the issue in a way that would not necessarily let you mirror the construct in output types, right? It's like we have unions and interfaces in output types, but if you required tagged unions to achieve input polymorphism, then the structure of the type it is required to be different in the input and the output, right? Because you have the wrapper type. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure like if you necessarily need to connect this to output types directly. Like if you just look at your input for a second, the question for me still remains if there's a proposal like Ivan where you fundamentally focus on multiple fields and you only want one of them. This is the core idea of Ivan's proposal, or also of the one-off directive, as far as I understand. If you focus on this, is this what you describe as polymorphism for input types or not? Because in my mind, it's a little bit like you can't really see, you can express it in the type system, but it's not different types. It's not polymorphism in the sense of you get different types for different input values. You just get a constraint which says only one field is allowed.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think it's sort of a compromise, right? Like we hadn't been able to reach a place where we had sufficient input polymorphism. And so like people have already adopted this tagged union patterns without the constraint. So a compromise would be let's build a constraint into the type system so at least you can express it in the schema definition. But the ideal situation from my perspective is being able to leverage some kind of a union actually, an actual union, so that like where I work, New Relic, we have dashboards. People are probably familiar with them, and they have little widgets, you know, and each one has a different type. Like this kind of chart has this parameters. This kind of chart is like a markdown little section. This kind of chart's a line one. So each one has very different parameters. We want to be able to model that API so that you can use the same shape of structure, submit it in, and get it back, right? Like, and so if we have to use the tagged union, that kind of screws that up, and people have to do like a pretty significant like mapping transformation over the data structure to be able to use it both in input and output. So this is for me like a core motivator, is to get a symmetrical API with polymorphism. And tagged unions are a compromise, which doesn't fully achieve that, but it's better than nothing. But the sticking point for actual input unions generally is how do you express the type? And there are significant challenges because by definition, the type names at least are forced to be different. So like if you had a union of 5 widget types on the output, those names are required to be different on the input. So out of the gate, we kind of have like a situation where it's very difficult to have a mirror, like to mirror any aspect of the polymorphism we do have for outputs into inputs.
I want to just add that I think what we've learned in sort of litigating through all our options here is that there's actually 2 separate problems in what you just posed, Vince. One of them is about input polymorphism specifically, and another one is about sharing models between input and output. So I think Benji's most fleshed out direction, the RFC for the tag type, where there's actually like pretty detailed spec text that describes how they will work, attempts to tackle both. And I think the feedback that we got on this was pretty clear, that tackling both problems in the same RFC is perhaps unwise, which for what it's worth, I think I agree with now that I've like really dug deep into that feedback. I think that's probably right. My sense, my advice would be to decouple those 2 problems, and ideally in a way that they can overlap. So to be able to express the constraint in the way that Andy and Yvonne have been kind of framing this, it's a constraint where you say, given some type, whether it's input or output, as Yvonne's proposing, narrow that down to say, okay, you have some set of exclusive fields or something along those lines. And then a separate where we might in the future want to introduce a type that is shared between input and output. There's a separate ball of problems that we'll have to tackle with that. I think we made a good stab at with the tag type proposal, but I think still there's like the question of how you evolve those things in the future and wanting to make them explicit. That I think we're getting close to, but I don't know, does that resonate with you, of wanting to kind of like treat these as 2 separate problems that when combined together solves the core use case that your team is interested in?
Maybe, but the problem is like if we introduced a new type that was able to be used in inputs and outputs, we would need to be also able to use unions on those types for inputs. And we still are presented with the conundrum of how do you express the name of that type.
Well, here's just like a high level idea of how that might come together based on Benji's work on the tag type. So the tag type it's a brand new type, that it internalizes this constraint of only allowing one field, whether it's input or output. But then a property of that type, you have to specify whether it's only allowed in the input position, only allowed in the output position, or allowed in both. That, for what it's worth, I think solves your problem. Like you can use the mixed version and tagged, and then from there on down, there's the constraint that you can only ever use types that are also allowed in mixed positions, right?
Just to interrupt for a moment, there is no
yeah.
both anymore.
Oh, there's no both anymore. You took that out. Okay. Well, that was the original pitch, I think, that you made, Benji. So maybe that's wise to have taken that out. But it does break what Vince was looking for. But maybe speaking to one version old of your proposal, that's how that worked. I can imagine.
I don't think that's true, actually. So responding to Vince's pattern, it's very similar to how input objects and output objects can mirror each other, right? They don't have the same name, but they can mirror each other, and that's fine. And you can do the same with tagged. You can have a tagged input type and a tagged output type that have the same fields that reference not the same types, because obviously the input one's going to reference the input type and the output one's going to reference the output type, but those can be those mirrored types that we just mentioned. So you can actually model Vince's issue with the tagged type as it currently stands, and you can solve that problem. I think the main issue that you're going to get is evolution of your types and your queries. If you are pulling down your types through a query where you've requested all the various things that you support at this time, and then you're manipulating that on the client and then sending it back up again, imagine that's an overwrite rather than a patch. If you were to then add a field or add an option to that thing, or if you were to add something to it, you wouldn't be querying it in your old GraphQL query. So you couldn't then write it back again. If you were to use an old client. So you'd have to actually update your client at the same time that you update your schema, which is an issue that we don't really have at the moment, though arguably we do have that already with output object types and input object types. Like if you were to take an output object and try and write it straight back and overwrite, you'd still have this similar issue. But yeah, I think it can be used to solve Vince's issue.
But I think it seems like the only thing the tagged actually adds is the one field constraint. Like I can already do that with existing types, both input and output. Like the only difference is a schema check. So I kind of wonder, like, why do we need to add a whole new type just to do that one little validation?
That's why it was originally proposed as just a modification to the introspection, which was exposed as a directive, but it could be any syntax really. And honestly, I think that's one of the things that we've lost going this longer typed union approach is the brevity and the simplicity of that solution. And it's one of the things that does make me quite concerned about it, because we're adding quite a complex new system which has a lot of questions around it. Should it be valid for output as well as input, and various other things? And I'm not sure that we're getting as much value from that as we were from what was originally effective. I think it was like 6 lines modification to the spec or something tiny like that when I added the original one. This one's massive. So yeah, there is truth to that.
Yeah.
I think that's the right question. And Yvonne's proposal, I think, adds a second question, which is this a constraint on the entire type, or is this a constraint on a subset of the type? Which I think is interesting. It's a trade-off between flexibility and complexity. It's certainly simpler to say you express the constraint in exactly one place, which is when you describe the type itself, versus you express the constraint on each field, which is relevant to the constraint. I expect probably a large majority of cases will have to express the constraint on every single field in the type. That's most of the cases we've seen. I'd love to know if there's enough examples that kind of fit the motivation you you see, Yvonne, of like wanting to lift out individual fields?
One addition for me, it's another big reason is that I want a feature parity between arguments and fields in input fields,
Hmm.
especially like for directives. I don't want to park arguments inside input of
Could we apply the same logic though of does the constraint apply per argument or does it apply to all arguments in the field? Do you know what I mean?
not exactly.
That makes
So-
sense. Like you would say, you can only submit one argument.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this field can only have one argument as opposed to saying of these 2 out of 3 total arguments, you can only supply one of these 2. It's just, I think it'd be same argument, just a different piece of the schema, right?
Yeah, I just like I could not figure out a good syntax for expressing that in SDL. So like we should not design GraphQL feature based only on SDL, but it's a factor.
Yeah.
So
I think
we had it.
it's become pretty clear to me that like the way forward in SDL is directives, right? Like there really seems unlikely to be a case where we want to add like new special SDL syntax because like directives are the point of, it's the way to extend the type system and it's fully supported in SDL.
Yeah, we
Can I ask-
should favor. Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, can I ask why? Like, I'm not saying we should make up crazy syntax just out of our head, but SDL is our syntax. It's a GraphQL syntax, so it's our tool to express our type system. And I feel like to restrict ourselves arbitrarily to not touch this syntax is a little bit non-convincing for me. Because if we can't extend it, who else? And directives. So I'm not saying we should do this here at this point, but I think in general, never touch the syntax is a little bit too restrictive for me, especially if everything else is kind of too awkward or it doesn't fit, right? Like I think expressiveness is the goal of the SDL and readability. And if we, for example, want to express a certain constraint, but we can't do it in a clear way with directives, we should think about other things. At least be open about it.
I think that's right. My sense is that directives is where we should usually start because they are a way to add additional data onto existing types. And we should lean out of that when in one of 2 scenarios. Either the directive syntax is not expressive enough to cover the use cases that we want to provide, or if the directive syntax is too confusing and it's a use case where we expect many people will use it and they will be confused by the directive syntax. But if we're in a position where it's like we have to choose between using a directive or using a keyword that comes just in a slightly different place in the same line in an SDL, then that would seem obvious to me. And that may be where we are going here. Because if you take even just literally the syntax that's in Benji, your RFC right now, it says tagged input and then the name of the type. And if you just delete the word tagged, it just looks exactly like a regular input type. And so if the semantics aren't different enough to warrant it being a different type, then have we circled all the way back around to your original proposal and we just like stick an @ sign in front of the word tagged, move it into the right spot where directive goes and carry on. And that basically is kind of right back to your one of proposal. I think the reason why we have been exploring this path is in exploring the direction where you could use tags in both inputs and outputs, it was clear that that was a new kind of thing. And we needed it to be a new kind of type in the type system. If we are going to break that and there's no longer a case where this is a mixed type, then is that still true? Like, are there semantics about this that really demand it being a different type? Because I think a solid half of the text of that RFC change is just purely adding in the new type into the world. And if we can avoid that, that seems like a complexity win.
So I think one important thing for us to ponder is like, if we go the path of a one of, that adds a new feature, which is nice and it has value and it brings a constraint to the compile time, to the schema time. But I kind of like what Evan here just mentioned in the chat, like we still don't have the ability to do a real union. And to use this kind of, like we can't, we forego the ability to mirror the output unions in input unions.
So can you explain what you can you explain what you mean with real unions on input? Like, what do you mean with that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. Using the one of to express polymorphism generates a wrapper object that uses the field name as a pseudo type name. Whereas in outputs, we have real polymorphism with the on fragment kind of sort of query pattern. So we simply we're achieving some form of polymorphism, but it has basically no resemblance to the existing polymorphism in GraphQL.
I would even say this is no polymorphism at all. For me, one of is not adding a type or whatever. It's a constraint expressed in the type system, which lets you specify exactly one. That is my understanding. So I agree with you. This is no polymorphism on the input types. The question is, maybe it's enough. You know, the question is, maybe it solves 80% of the use cases. And because if you want to add real polymorphism, we are all back to the questions: how do you express it? Like, how do you express different types, or how do you make clear what kind of type you want to provide? And I think I've not seen a good answer to this. Like the best way, even if I didn't like it personally so much, but the best thing was still like you need to supply a type name or something to express what type you have. This is still like the most reasonable one I ever saw.
I agree with that too.
That's, yeah.
The by the way, the union feature, you all know GraphQL's history, that it was pretty different before it went open source. I added the union type in that intermeeting phase before it became open source, but it wasn't part of the original Facebook stack. I got pushback for it. Basically, people were looking at like, hey, we already have interfaces. Do we really also need this new concept of unions? I still think it was the right call. We'd need that separate concept. But given the benefit of hindsight, and especially in the context of this discussion, I actually feel like the constraint model or the tagged union kind of polymorphism for unions is cleaner than the union type. Like having to recycle the inline fragment syntax to do unions is, there's pros and cons to it. It's not a perfect win. And the fact, like, actually one of the things I really don't like about it is that it's forced needing to query the type name field everywhere. And maybe that it would be true anyway because of interfaces, but I don't love that. Like, one of the original goals was that you should be able to write a query without having to get into the weeds of introspection, look at the result and know exactly what's going on. For interfaces, that's actually like pretty reasonable. You can see that because interfaces, they only supply the fields that all the types supply anyway. For unions, you end up in a bunch of confusing circumstances that I think the extra level of having the tag would have clarified. So Evan mentioned this in the chat. I'm kind of on board. I know that it would be a little bit of an awkward path to have two different ways to express polymorphism in the output system, but I do see it as a potential benefit of going the route of whether we want to represent it as a directive or some other syntactical purpose, but having something that can appear in more than just the input case that purely expresses this kind of constraint seems like a really nice way to actually get back to the point where both inputs and outputs can use the same kind of model. But I don't know. I know it's not perfect, but I wanted to throw out that.
or background to a one-of directive that applies on both inputs and outputs.
So
Circle never ends.
interestingly, this is something I've given a lot of thought, because obviously the question of it there now being 3 types of polymorphism in the output schema has been one of the big bits of pushback here. And the main question has been, why, when would you use an interface versus a union versus a tag type? And I already have jokingly answered a few times, never use a union, just always use the tag type. Use the interface where an interface makes sense. Like if you've got a common interface where everything in that interface implements those fields, then use an interface. If you don't have that, really, there's not much advantage that, I mean, there's one advantage that the union gives you over a tag type, and that is that you can query the type name even if you don't know in advance what it can be. So if, for example, you wrote your schema at the time when there were only cats and dogs, and then at a later time you added fish, you could get back the fact that this would have been a fish. You didn't know about fish, so you can't query into the fields on it, but you know at least it was going to be a fish. But that seems a very, very, very slight thing. It doesn't seem particularly useful. Here's the thing I don't understand. It's a fish, but I don't know.
A human reader might get something out of that, but like the vast majority of GraphQL use cases are an actual piece of software on the client writing and reading these results, in which case it does not give a toot about what that value is if it doesn't know how to deal with it.
Exactly. So what advantages will we get from switching over to tagged? And there's quite a few of them. I mean, one of them is that it would mirror the input tagged, which is a benefit, as Vince has pointed out. But another one is like we could then put scalars in unions, which is something that quite a few people have asked for various different use cases. Some of them it's because their data stores are more diverse, like MongoDB, where it can be different types. There's also like big APIs out there, like Stripe's API, for example, will return a string for something, or it might return an object for that thing. And some would argue that GraphQL's purpose would be to then turn it into an object so that you don't have to worry about it. And I would agree with that personally, but I'm not writing all of the schemas in the world. So there we go. There's also that it would allow unions of wrapper type. And this is also something that I've seen requested a lot on the GraphQL spec repo. And interestingly, one of the most common requests is like, oh, I want to be able to represent either an integer or an array of integers, or a string or an array of strings, at which point I always reply, well, you can already do that. Just make it a list and coercion will fix it for you. But there is a lot of demand for that kind of thing. And then as Lee pointed out already, like the query syntax for it, rather than using like inline fragments or whatever to say like on this type, do this, you just go dog, curly braces, and then you're done. You put the dog stuff in there. It's I think much easier, much more accessible for people that are new to it. So I literally have in my notes here, should we get rid of union? Should we deprecate union? And I'm happy that we are actually like talking about it. I'm not sure if we'll necessarily take that direction, but I think it does warrant talking about.
Actually, like a little bit, like I must say, one of the most, to be clear, I'm not a fan that GraphQL has union and interfaces. It come up too often in the modeling of schemas that you don't know really where to use which. Like I totally understand the reasoning, and it's not a fault or whatever. It's just like I literally have written articles internally at least trying to explain the up and down, because it always comes back, and this unclear modeling structures kind of takes away of the simplicity of GraphQL in some aspects. GraphQL shines really because it doesn't overload you with a lot of things you don't want to or need to, and union versus interfaces is kind of this discussion which is not really fruitful. So having both, I'm not a fan of it, and so this is why I'm really conservative about adding a third one without having a clear stand of removing another one, which probably is not possible, or like at least clearly saying this is, we don't use it anymore. I think if we ever even want to think slightly of adding tagged unions as a type, we need to at the same time having a very firm stand on what to do with the existing union. I think this needs to come in a pair. Otherwise, we make GraphQL much, much more complicated and confusing for the users. And maybe, I don't know, we get rid of interfaces. I don't know, I'm not saying it. I'm just saying, like, it's like adding more options to something that has already too many options in my mind is not a good path. This is the high-level thought. And it's interesting, like Evan wrote in the chat, like that in Shopify you basically go with the opposite way. That's correct, Evan. You kind of recommend people to use unions everywhere.
We use unions everywhere we can. Actually, like I wouldn't get rid of interfaces because there are some cases, but I would be interested in a proposal to restrict them to a single field. That like an interface can only define one common field, because that is like all of the use cases where we've said, oh, actually an interface makes sense here and is more useful than just unioning, is a single field where the interface represents like a shared behavior rather than like inheritance.
The thing is, we went in the total
interestingly-
opposite way with interfaces and interfaces recently, right? Like we went in the opposite way and made interfaces more powerful and giving you actually like a hierarchy of it.
Yeah.
That's also interesting.
We went
Facebook
all in
actually
on
has a
interfaces.
bunch of
We use the heck out of interfaces, and it's super powerful, and we love it. We like have had almost no situations where we've used a union or needed it. So, but it, you know,
The
modeling
example,
strategies.
Yeah,
turns out there's
I-
many of them.
I have an example for this that I can paste in the chat. It's a bit long, so bear with me. But basically, we found that people doing interfaces like that, forgive my lack of formatting, that something like that is almost always better for the client when it gets rewritten like that.
Can you just walk us through?
So the top one is a pretty standard interfaces and as inheritance. You have a top level shipping package interface, and then you have a couple of implementing versions, one where it's a box, one where it's a tube, maybe ones where it's like a, I don't know, special size package or something. And each of those has a few extra fields on top of the many common fields in the interface. We find that it's usually work better for us to rewrite those where you define a standard output type for shipping package that has all of the common fields. And then it also has a final field, which is a union of a bunch of little types that hold the specific fields. And the reason this has worked better for us is because then if you end up wanting to like polymorphize it along a different dimension, you can just add another field with another union type to the bottom of shipping package. Whereas if you want a cross-cut set of polymorphic types with interfaces, you need to generate, like you need to manually generate all of the possible combinations as concrete types, and it gets kind of messy. And also means like if you don't care about the dimension of difference, which is like in this case the dimensions, you don't have to worry about the polymorphism aspect of it at all. You can just like deal with objects.
Yeah, like I can attest to that. I saw this pattern also successfully used, that you kind of transform the hierarchy into push it out into a field and make it like type of the field, which adds a different, like the downside a little bit is like you get an extra layer, right? Like you get an extra field you need to query on top of it. It's like not one list of fields, it's like you need to go one pass down, but this was passed down is like in GraphQL it doesn't cost anything there, right? That's the interesting part.
Yeah,
it's just
so
like
we do support and use interfaces in a few places still, and we don't forbid them outright, but we definitely kind of promote this as the default pattern.
This is good advice. I like this pattern. And especially since the worst part of having to lift the polymorphism to the top level is when you query it, you immediately are faced with inline fragments or fragments in order to resolve the polymorphism. A I'll give you both the pros and cons of the motivating case for these at Facebook, which was if you see a post in your feed, you want to know who it was that wrote that post. And there's lots of different kinds of entities that can put a post in your feed. So we had this concept called an actor, and an actor was either a person or a page, or could be a couple of other things. And they had all of the common fields that you needed that were relevant to the context of rendering a post in a feed. And that was nice. And you could ask for additional properties of that. But I don't know, maybe it would have been better to just say, hey, the common fields here are just all there. And then if you want extra info, you have to ask for user, or which could be there or null, or page, which could be there or null, or maybe that's your tagged variety. But I taught the like weekly onboarding course so people could pick up GraphQL, and it was always frustrating to have to like leap way ahead and be like, hey, so I know I haven't talked about this concept of fragments yet. I'll get to that, but like I want to write a query that you can see, and the thing that you're probably most interested in is looking at some stories in your newsfeed. So I'm on board with this idea that pushes initial complexity like down the pipe to like when you have the motivating case, then you're faced with it, and if you don't have that motivating case, then you're not burdened by it. That's good advice.
Yeah, and all of the cases where we have ended up using interfaces kind of feel like Node. So like here's the example from our docs, which is like we have an interface for things that have meta fields, where meta fields is like a feature that is common across a bunch of kind of widely varying objects at Shopify. So like this we use an interface for, but it looks and feels kind of like Node in that it's like a single field, and it's just a specific piece of behavior that's common across a whole bunch of random objects.
Mm-hmm.
Like I try to distinguish often between like this is not really it's not really a fruitful type. You know, it's like more like a low level, you share something across a lot of things type, like similar to Node. Like this is like I think interfaces can be used kind of for both at the moment, where you really express something meaningful, or you express something like more low level. And what you're hinting for is like the more low level area you're going with here, right? Like, okay.
So how does this help us solving our sort of input polymorphism?
I think I brought it up just because it contributes to the impression that like three types is too many, and if we want to go with like one of or tagged unions as an output, then we should probably at the same time like formally say no, unions are dead. Like we're not going to get rid of them because backwards compatibility, but you know, preferably stop using them.
So imagine that you didn't already have this this legacy of this massive GraphQL API that you've designed, Evan. Would the tagged type as an output type work well in the situations that you're currently proposing? Like, would you be happy with it there? I'll give you a moment to think about that because I think it's quite a deep question.
I think so, but I'll give it some thought and make sure that that's actually true.
Like you'd want to do in this dimensions case, you'd have like dimensions box, and then the fields are dimensions tube, and then the fields like to replace that union pattern, and you feel like that would just be like a net win across the board, and you just encourage that as your new default.
I think so.
But in this example, you would need to have like a one-off for a subset of the fields, right? You would have like a bunch of different, like you would have a box dimension fields and the tube dimension fields, and they are one-off, and all the other fields are actually not one-off, right?
No, I think you just have dimension, just exactly the same as here. You'd have the dimensions, which would then point to a tagged type, and the tag type would then say if it's a box, then it uses the box dimensions. If it's
but then you had two levels, right? Then
yes.
You need to go 2 levels down.
Yes.
You already need to go 2 levels down in this case because you need to go to dimensions, and then you need to put an inline fragment for the various type.
Yeah.
This
in my head.
Based on
from a
comes
querying
out
point
as
of view,
one level, but from a querying point of view, it's the same.
Yeah, that's part of why I like part of my rationale, and you know, with hindsight, had I been looking at the union pattern from day one, I should have taken this path a little bit more seriously. I overweighted the value of the output not having the level of indirection, thinking like, hey, you know, this like why wrap dimensions in a sub object? Like those all feel like properties. Semantically, those are all properties of your shipping package. They're not like dimensions isn't a thing. Like what is that? It's just a wrapping body, and that feels dirty. And that was like my design angle to solve. And I think I overweighted it, you know, like if you look at the actual query text that you have to write between using something like tagged or one of and union, they all actually end up looking relatively similar. But the benefit of one of and tagged is that the query syntax is actually simplified. Like you remove the concept of an inline fragment in that particular case and are left right back with plain old boring GraphQL subselection, which I think is, I underweighted the complexity cost of that at the time. That's my sort of retrospective analysis of the situation. But I'm not against adding the concept of tagged or one of or exclusive or whatever to the output fields. Like we should not let variability be the enemy of progress, right?
But we like, again, like I think there's like a meta level to it. Like there's a technical solution, but introducing this technical solution without clear guidance how to think about it is dangerous for the ecosystem. I think we need to think like we already see here totally different patterns, like Vince using a lot of interfaces, Evan goes in totally opposite direction, and this is kind of a sign that we're probably not providing enough guidance at the moment, or like that it's like already fragmented. Like let's overuse the word fragment, but so like if we want to add more variance, we really need to have like a bigger stand on the best practices there.
Yeah,
this is my like ecosystem.
Completely agree. And I suspect we'll have to kind of hit that on all fronts if we were to go that path, like both in the spec itself, like as you were reading this and you're like, there's 3 different ways to do polymorphism. I wonder when I would choose each. Like we should explicitly answer that question in the spec document. In addition to blog posts, conference talks, all of our usual channels that get much more viewership than spec, for people to understand what this thing is and how it fits. And I don't know necessarily that I would go quite as bold as saying, don't use unions anymore, only use this thing, because frankly, I don't know enough about how people are modeling their own data. And it could be that that advice is bad advice for some particular case that we haven't thought about yet. And so instead, I think probably to use Evan's terminology here, like treat these as reasonable defaults. Like if you're thinking about the space, using a tagged type is going to be simpler on net for you. And if you, but like here we can explain the pros and cons of the different tools at their disposal and be like, if you're not sure, use a tag type. That's probably your answer. That's going to result in simpler queries.
There's still people that use var with JavaScript, but clearly let and const are superior.
Yep. And actually, that's a really good parallel, because I remember fight after fight after fight in those TC39 meetings on exactly the same thing of like, you're going to have 2 different ways to define a variable with subtly different semantics, and people are not going to know which way to do, like how to do one versus the other. And you're going to have code bases with a mix, and it's going to be a disaster. And like, that's partially true, but ultimately I don't think it ended up being that painful. People just kind of figured it out. I think we'll probably end up in a similar situation. Part of the reason why I don't want to go too heavy is like, there's going to be a ton of existing schemas out there that make heavy use of unions, especially since a really common theme over the last couple of years is like how to deal with errors and recommending the union pattern to deal with errors. So there's a bunch of people are going to feel burned if we're like, yeah, don't use unions anymore, do this other thing. They're like, but wait, your advice up until now has been to use unions. We're like, oh, right. Yeah. Okay. That was still good advice. Just do that same pattern, but with this new tool. So I want to be kind of also cautious of making people feel like they're not burned. And especially since it's not a very easy migration path. If you're already using explicit unions everywhere and output positions, you will break things if you try to like explicitly replace them. And I don't know that we want to go, like, we should be able to say, if you're already using unions and it's working for you, that's fine. It might be more painful to try to migrate those in your existing schema than just sticking with what you have. But for new stuff, you probably want to consider this. And if you're building a new service and a new type system from scratch, you probably want to go all in on tag types or one-ofs. But good point, Andy.
So where does it leave us? We have open questions tackling input and output at the same time. So we have open questions. Do we want to introduce a new type or just like a directive with kind of adds like a constraint without introducing a new type?
And then we also have the question Andy posed of, or Yvonne posed of, does this constraint apply to an entire type or an entire, in the case of arguments, all arguments within a field, or does it apply to a subset of them?
Yes, that's also a good question, I think.
Maybe to dig into the, does this need to be a new kind of thing or can it be a directive? Benji, you're probably closest to this because you actually wrote all the spec language.
For both.
I remember for both. I remember part of what led us in the direction of this being a new type was that there was enough semantic differences and in some cases grammatical differences between what a tag type was allowed to do and what other types were allowed to do that it led us on that path. Now that you've evolved it a bit, you explicitly removed the idea of having a mixed type, input and output.
Well, the directive never supported that anyway, right?
Right. But now that you're, I guess I'm curious of if was the, were we kind of like over rotating on this idea of having the same kind of thing in both input and output? Is that what led us on this being a new kind of type? Or are there other semantics that would still motivate us away from a directive solution?
So there's a bunch of questions that I've answered in that thread. And one of them is this very question in which I say, I don't really explain this well. Lee convinced me. Maybe Lee will tell you what he said to me.
Oh shit, okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like this will happen.
If I remember correctly, there were two motivating factors for a full type. One of them was this input-output sharing, which we've talked about. And the other one was that unions on output are first class. And so it felt like unions on input should also be first class. But I think that one is also addressed if we go down the route of saying, well, maybe unions on output are sort of deprecated.
So,
Or
like,
underfavored at least. And it's also, we can use syntax to our advantage to communicate what feels first class or not, because I think if you look at the syntax that Benji's has in the latest version of that RFC, tagged input feels a whole hell of a lot like input type name and then @tagged. And it's like, if the actual introspection of those two syntactical representations would be equivalent, right? They would both, in the direction that we're talking about going now, if we decide that tag type isn't a new kind of thing, we're just saying there's already a concept of an input structured type. All we're doing is saying now that it is a tagged variant of that thing. And so there'd just be a new, I imagine, a new field in introspection that's like, it's tagged, or it's one of, or it's exclusive. And if we want to represent that in syntax in exactly the same way that it currently is in the RFC, maybe that feels more first class. That's a trade-off syntactical determination that we could make.
So there's some absolutely huge advantages of going with the original proposal, the one which was just a field on the Dunder type introspection type, right? Where it was just an additional thing that said this is a one of, or this is a whatever. And there are loads, but one of them is existing GraphQL clients can use it already. They can already use it. They can already query it, and they can already put input into it without updating them. Like literally the 2017 Apollo client can do it. 2015's Relay can do it. There is some very subtle issues that they may face, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with like the cache architecture of those clients to tell you whether that will be a problem. But that is like, if you request a type and you have the one-of on it, you will get back the one field and all the other fields won't be null, they just won't be present. And that is the distinction, right? Otherwise, we can just use the one-of to do basically exactly the same as what we have. It's just adding the type safety on top. It's just putting what would have been a runtime check into into validation time. That's really all it is. And I think that is hugely valuable. But I think, for the various reasons we sort of pushed, like, actually this changes the behavior of these things, and does it make sense to actually use the fields to represent this?
There is an important breaking change if you were to go down that path. And now I'm remembering part of the motivation to make this a new type is how we treat nullability. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, part of the original proposal required all of the fields to be non-null. And there's definitely a difference between the omission of a field and the nullability of a field. And we already have some sort of definition of requiredness versus nullability for inputs. This adds like another dimension to that kind of problem, because if you have a type today that says I have X, Y, and Z, and they're all non-null, that requires that all three must be present. And if you add a directive that says one of, or exclusive, or tagged, now it does the opposite. It requires that only one out of three must be present.
If that was the case, and I don't think it was, I think that was the case for the original bit where I actually wrote the new type system for tagged. But if it was the case, it shouldn't be. They should all be nullable, because effectively they should be compatible with what people are already doing in their GraphQL schemas. So you might have a user field where you say by ID or by username or by email. In that case, all of those arguments would have been optional. And what the one-of would do is it say, actually, one of these is required, but all the others you must not give. Like, it effectively sets the nullability of one of them. It forces you to pass it. Now, it is different, but at the moment we already have that. We're just doing it at runtime. We're checking, we're asserting in the resolver that exactly one of those is set. And if it wasn't, we threw an error. Whereas now we're moving that to validation time for the query. But other than that, it would be the same. And with the directive approach, everything would be nullable. It would have to be nullable.
I don't think, I don't want us to end up in a position where things have to be nullable, because I do think there's a distinct difference between saying this field is nullable versus this field is not the field I'm choosing in this exclusivity match, right? So like, for example, if I say, give me a dog or give me a cat, and both are nullable and an exclusive, that should imply that it's legal for me to send you a body that says dog : null as the body. You said it was nullable, I gave you null.
I think that's actually okay. I think we can allow that.
But you might not want that. Like your constraint might be, you must give me either a dog or a cat, and it is not okay to give me null. And you do want ability to express that. So I don't think we want to be in a position where we say, if your type is a tag type or a one-of, then you're required to make all the fields non-nullable. That's definitely what, for people who are emulating this pattern before this constraint explicitly exists, that's what they're doing. So, and I think you're right in that case, right? Like they can add this additional constraint and produce value for themselves in doing so on a very short path. But they're still kind of left in that scenario where, I mean, it doesn't reduce the usefulness. It just doesn't solve that particular problem in the case where they're going from an emulated version to the real deal. But I suspect that most new cases of using a tag type or a one-of type would actually prefer to not have nullable fields in most cases. Presumably, if you're picking one out of many, you don't want to start by saying or 0 in the case where you want to give me null, because that might be like a weird pitfall people might fall into. Same thing, by the way, for part of the value of the GraphQL type system, and hopefully this addition to it, is that your internal system, if it has a type system, dynamic or static, can now have information about exactly what you're going to expect. And so for an input object, in the emulated one of situation, the type of that thing in your internal system is, you know, I have X, Y, and Z fields, and they are all nullable. And in an exclusive version of that type where they're non-null, or one of version where they're non-null, you actually have I have one of either an object with a single field called X that's non-null, or an object with a single field Y that's non-null, or an object with a single field Z that's non-null. And for something like TypeScript or Kotlin or some of the languages that have good tools to deduce that pattern, that can be super, super useful to have. So I want to make sure we provide the ability to produce that pattern for folks, because I think people will expect it.
I agree. And I think basically that is doable on output, absolutely. And then on input, we can be more flexible. So like if you send cat, null, dog, you know, objects, that we can make that valid. We can just cover that up in coercion. So I don't think that has to be an issue. Also, the difference between not giving a pet and giving a pet that is a cat or a dog, I think we can handle it the layer above with a non-null on the tagged where you actually reference the tagged type. So I've given an example there, put a bang in triangular brackets, that's optional. So it could be that you don't give a pet or that you require a pet.
Right, but in that case, you could still provide, you know, here I'll type this.
I mean,
that this would be a valid input object.
That would be valid with the current GraphQL specification, yes. But with this additional constraint added, it wouldn't be valid. And at the moment, if you had this as a system that you'd modeled just using an input type, you would probably have a resolver that was doing this check for you and making sure that one of them was not null and was throwing an error. And now we're just moving that to validation. So I think that wouldn't be valid according to the new spec, but it would be kind of it'd be non-breaking because it's a new thing anyway, right?
Yeah, maybe we're too in the weeds, but oh yeah, so go ahead, Andy.
I must say, coming back to the output type change that you can omit fields or the result, I'm not sure this is like we can tolerate this kind of change in this way. It feels like it really violates one of the core principles of GraphQL, that you get what you ask for if you don't know the one-off directive, for example. Like if we go down with a one-off directive and it's not an explicit type and you just add it and suddenly you don't get back fields, it's really like there's like, except skip, what Evan wrote is like you always get back the field you ask for. And I'm not sure how clients can deal with this and server-side mapping code easily, to be honest. Like,
we kind of
this
already
might
have
be
that.
trick.
I sort of agree, but we also kind of already have that with skip and include, and we have it with fragment spreads as well. Like if the fragment spread isn't valid, then you don't get back those fields that you requested. So we already have this situation, but yes, this would make it like without any of those additional, without a directive and without a fragment spread, you would then have this situation in the base level as well. But we can still deal with that because introspection will tell us that that is a thing that we can expect. So I'm on the fence about that as an issue.
Honestly, I would be happy if it's not an issue. I don't want to make up problems. If it's not an issue, I'm happily with it. I just want to call out, I'm not really sure about that it's a non-issue. But if we assume for a second it's a non-issue, then really it feels like the simplest approach we should maybe evaluate is a one-off directive for input and output. Like this is kind of the simplest, like for all fields. Like I think this is the simplest one. If we have the three questions, input and output together, directive or new type, and multiple fields or the whole type, I think like the simplest combination is probably the one-off directive. And we should maybe try to answer if this is not a good solution. Does this sound reasonable or?
Yeah, I think part of the aim of today is definitely to figure out whether the tag type is the right solution, to weigh up some of the others, to look at Ivan's been talking about his solution for a while, so it's good that we've seen that now, and I think it's pretty isomorphic to what I'm proposing with tagged. I deliberately didn't add with what was one of. I deliberately didn't add it to arguments at that time. I definitely wanted it, but I thought it's got more chance of getting through if we just do this one thing, and then we can add it to arguments as a second follow-up. So I definitely really want that. I also didn't propose it for output at the same time. I mentioned that it could be used for output, but carefully didn't propose that with the original directive. So I think Ivan's solution is very isomorphic to the original one of, except it has that one difference, which is that you can have additional fields alongside it. Other than that, it's just a syntactical difference whether to use syntax versus a directive. Which is, you know, a discussion we've had quite a few times with a tagged keyword or a, you know, circumflex or whatever you're going to call it. So Tim's here. Tim, you wrote originally like one of the oldest proposals for this, right? I think
right.
For input polymorphism. So you've seen all this sort of come and go, you've paid attention. What are your thoughts on this at the moment?
I think I was talking to Ivan about his most recent one, and the thing that I really liked about that came up a decent bit when we were originally discussing this was like the ability to evolve required fields. So like the ability to have a field that's required on an input argument and then be able to replace it with a new argument without breaking it. So that was something, I guess, that was new to me with that. Otherwise, I guess I was sort of on the fence about the tagged approach, like that extra level of wrapping and sort of indirection, and sort of was along the lines of a lot of what Vince was saying about wanting like a true union type that mirrored the output union type, but hearing more from Lee about the background of that, like that it's maybe not wasn't fully thought out, or hearing about more of it. I think I am coming on board with the tagged I guess approach a little bit more, but yeah, mostly just listening at this point because I haven't contributed a ton since the original sort of used the type name.
I think one of the interesting properties that your original proposal has is it almost mirrors the output unions, right? You have to do a transform of the actual type name, so you do still have to walk the tree to do that, but it's a relatively minor transform potentially if you have like a naming convention for your types, for example.
Right, because the types are never going to be named the same unless you have a type that applies to both, like tagged.
Exactly. But other than that, it's like the objects are the same shape. So walking the tree seems relatively simple. For Vince, if you were to do your widgets thing, if you were to do that with a tagged output type and a matching tagged input type, I think you could do it without even needing any transform at all. I don't think you would need to rename anything or anything like that, because you just need to make sure that the fields all have the same names, right? Doesn't matter what the types are, it's only the fields that need to match up.
Yeah, that sounds plausible. It just means we forego the ability to use interfaces or unions. We have to like kind of go all in on this version.
Mm-hmm. I think, as Lee said, for schemas that are already using unions, you probably want to keep using unions. So this is more of a question for new schemas or new functionality that doesn't support unions. But as has been said, I think it's okay to evolve GraphQL. You know, it's been open source now for over 5 years, right? It's okay to introduce a new thing and say this other thing is, you know, it's fine, but maybe don't use it for new projects. I think that's fine. So I think one of the things I wanted to mention was in the thread recently, there was someone posted about using Fire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Fire, FHIR. It's like the really industry-wide data standard for I think like medical data exchange, like between hospitals and you know, medical practitioners and various people like that. And it's basically a really, really large data model that encompasses everything like identities and treatments and diagnoses and like, I don't know how many types it's got, like, but it must be a few hundred at least. And that was originally like Fire was also like the RESTful API that you would implement, and you'd implement probably a subset of that type system. But there is work on adding GraphQL support to Fire. I am not super familiar with Fire myself. I dabbled with it a tiny bit on a client project, and that was all. And at the time, the GraphQL implementation that I was using left a little to be desired. So it was interesting that it came up again specifically in the tagged thread. One of the things that they were saying there is that they would really like, because Fire already models these this polymorphism, they'd really like to be able to just use the Fire objects directly, and those were indicated with like a resource type, which would just be a string, for example. And that is actually one of the original proposals, right, that we would use a discriminator field. I was wondering how much weight the group felt that we should put to requirements like that, because we're effectively saying, if we were to go with tagged, for example, we'd be saying, well, you're going to have to transform your data. You're going to have to go through each of that and then turn it all into wrapper objects all the way through, and then send that back up to the schema. And I just wanted to gauge like how we feel about that in general. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think we've heard enough different use cases at this point that somebody's going to have to transform their data. So we can, try and serve the majority, but I don't think we can avoid it in the edge cases.
I can tell you what happens for us at New Relic. Like, enough people throw a fit about having to use the tagged input that I wind up like having to battle it out every time. And basically we wind up reaching a compromise where we have a combination of like a simplified tagged input that has like covers like 80% of the use cases. Maybe there's like 5 or 6 types in there. And then they have an open-ended scalar side by side with it that just does the thing they actually want, which is to like use the same data structure coming in and going out. So they just throw a fit until we have to give them an escape hatch to get out of GraphQL, basically. Which is unfortunate. And like, I battle to get that like mini input tagged union kind of in there so that the customer who is trying to learn how to use the API doesn't have just like a little blob that says, put all the right things in here. Like the platform can use the little like open-ended scalar that they know what to do with. But basically like people, yeah, we kind of have to like sidestep GraphQL in some certain cases, which just makes me sad.
I personally I have experience with OpenAPI spec before GraphQL a lot. So usually people use, even even if you don't have any like restriction or specification or anything, like you just use REST, simple REST endpoints, and JSON. People prefer to use like field called type or kind or something similar. So it's a most natural representation of like input polymorphism in even like output polymorphism. So like I'm for since we in preamble of specification said that we tailor GraphQL is tailored for needs of clients more. So I'm like for natural shape of like data shapes. But at the same time, why I always opposed using type names, because in OpenAPI case it was disaster. They had like a feature called discriminator that nobody supports. It's very confusing and it's hard to use. I'm co-founder at a company and we work for OpenAPI documentation and we support discriminators, and we are only few who support them. And like, it's hard to explain to people, and it's very hard to explain why in the middle of client's data you have like type name. And so it's like clicking outside of a system. We kind of have with underscore type name, but usually it's like yeah. So I'm personally like idea of special field type or kind. I just didn't figure out like how to make it in comparison reason. Plus previous proposals, people uncovered like some issues with that. You cannot reuse like parts of like some issues with schema design, like some problems for people creating schemas. But in general, I kind of like idea if we can model like special field like type or kind or something, but it should have a values, some like fixed values. So it should be cat or dog and not input cat, input dog.
Yeah, that was a version in that I sketched out in the RFC doc of like basically having some mapping of a scalar or an enum value to the type rather than using the explicit type name. That was the thing that I proposed and had the best what I considered the best opportunity to provide like good symmetry between, because you could use the exact same value to identify the type in the output and the input, and then you kind of get around the fact that the names of the types themselves are actually different by definition. I can't recall like why we didn't follow that too much further. We might have some notes around it. It is one of the more complex. It adds kind of a handful of new ideas of like literals, I think it was, or something.
Yeah, I think the literals direction was, at least to me, academically interesting, but pretty complicated. So I'm not opposed to exploring that path, but I just suspect from a practicality point of view that it might be pretty challenging. Just a lot of surface area of change.
So it's interesting we discussed some interesting things there. I came up with an idea in the shower this morning that is we have limited identifiers, right? Our identifiers are only alphanumeric and underscores. So we could potentially introduce a new symbol, which is what Ivan's done in the syntax, but I'm thinking in terms of the actual data that we transfer. So what I was thinking, and as I mentioned, I figured this out in the shower before then going for a full 8 hours of work, where I haven't thought about it, was like just introducing this idea of like a dollar type or something like that. Now, where I think this could be quite different from what we've got currently, and also the main issue that I have with it is that I don't think that you would actually select this, like you would just be given it. So in input types, you would have to provide it if it were an input union, for example. And on output types, you would be given it. Now, I'm not sure if giving it as part of the output of an existing union right now would be a problem or not. But we could do it so that it was only done for unions that were extended. But what this would allow is, for example, we could take our existing unions that we already have and we could add scalars to them. And effectively only the scalars would get boxed. Everything would get a dollar type sent along with it with the type name, which would be a duplicate of the Dunder type name. But we could also box the types like int or float or ID, JSON, any other custom scalars you've got. But you could then also use the mirrored objects to send back, and it would solve the literally it would mirror the existing union type. Why I thought this was interesting is because it doesn't introduce that additional layer that Andy mentioned earlier is potentially problematic in the data. Rather than having a field which then has an object as a child, it augments the existing object, and it would be done for you by GraphQL. Now, I don't like it because it adds that dollar type and it does it without you telling it to, and I don't like that. And I feel like there might be something in this, but what I currently have, which is like those 7 lines in chat, isn't quite it. But I felt it was worth sharing because you guys are pretty clever and maybe you can make something good of it. But yeah, it was just a thought that I had.
I suspect the idea of adding a field that always comes back regardless of whether it would be queried is probably not super palatable. Also, I feel like actually one of the we've gone pretty far down the path, but one of the things I really liked about the wrapping tag type or one of is you in that layer of nesting, you actually get context, right? Like in a traditional union, you can't say int or string in the case where you have like 2 different things that are both int but have different semantic meaning. And that seems like actually a feature of the tagged version. And I think we kind of like went through this in one of the previous meetings that we talked through, that just seems superior to having a type name in the input or output, is like seeing that more more semantically valuable piece.
I agree, especially for the finders. Like if you're finding by ID, it's going to be the ID type, but if you're finding by email or username, both of those are going to be string. So if you just said it was going to be an ID or a string, that's not very helpful. Then you have to sort of look at the string and see if it's got an @ character in it or whatever. But I think it's better to model that kind of thing in the way that we've proposed with, you know, the one of or the tagged. Obviously, tagged itself, as currently proposed in the tag type RFC, only applies to inputs and outputs. It doesn't actually apply to arguments, and that I think is one of it, in my opinion, is one of its biggest failings, and one of the reasons that actually I would like to push for us to go back to my original proposal. And I'm actually quite pleased that we've discussed potentially doing that, because it's so much simpler. I think it's going to be easier to implement, and it also opens those extra routes. It does have issues that need solving, but I don't think they're insurmountable, and it seems like a really neat, simple solution that solves the problem, does it well, doesn't have too many trade-offs. I just really like it as a solution, to be honest, that original one that was proposed.
Can you clarify like the arguments thing? Like you want to have like one off on the loss of arguments. Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So a bit like what Ivan proposed earlier, but without the required one as well. Like just only, they're all optional. So for example, it's quite common for a schema now to have multiple root level fields, like user by username, user by ID, user by email. And I think it's much better to just have user and then by ID or by email or by username, and then you can add more later. But it means that your schemas then, it's not as big, it's not as unwieldy. It's really like intimidating for someone when they load up the graphical pane and it's got like 4 or 5 times as many fields as you need. And I think that just having a user field is much more expressive.
That's definitely true. Like I'm recommending always at the moment to express it in different field names, because you can't express it at different arguments. Like you can't, if you make it, then you have like 5 optional, right? And you need to select at runtime which one is required. This is what you're talking about, right? Yeah. Okay, I agree with that. And this would be covered with a directive in some way. You can make it on the field, or how would you express this?
Yeah, I haven't actually written up the spec proposal for that, but effectively, yeah, you can think of it as basically saying, you say to this field is special in that all of its arguments are, they must all be nullable, and you must provide exactly one of them, in the same way that you could apply it to an input object, in which case all of its fields should be nullable and you must provide exactly one of them, or to an output object with the exact same constraints. So I only ever proposed it for the input object as a way of advancing that idea, but with the intention of them following it up with 2 separate pull requests, one to add it to arguments and one to add it to object types. Arguments first, object types would have been the last one, because I think it would have been the most divisive, because it was adding another form of polymorphism to output, which I thought would be challenging to get through, which it is.
I do think, I mean, part of what makes this tricky, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation, right? Because if we come out of the gates, it's like, oh, and in the future, this could apply in more places. It's like, well, we should probably make sure that it does. Otherwise, we'll like agree to this, get it out, people will start using it, and we'll go, oh, whoops, okay, it doesn't actually work in those other places. Oh no, and now it's like yet another thing that we can't reflect into symmetry in other parts of the type system. So even if we do like, yeah.
I could probably have written all 3 of those specs in less time than it's taken me to write the tag type spec. So
yeah, that's basically what I'm suggesting. It's like you get the whole thing out, and then if the pushback is like, actually, let's tackle this incrementally, then you carve parts out. But I do think, so the circling back to the directive idea makes sense. I do want to really explore what breaks if we do that. Especially along the upgrade path and the like old client, new server path. So like forward and backwards compatibility. So I'm imagining you have a tag type. It says, you know, you've got X, Y, and Z fields. All of them are non-null, but it's exclusive or it's a one of, so you can only provide one of them. But an older client would look at that, and if it doesn't know about that directive yet, it would say, I need to provide all 3 fields. And so it thinks, you think they should always be nullable. It's required by using the directive that the fields be nullable.
If it's an old client, then they must have been nullable previously, right?
Old server. I'm saying old client.
Yeah, but your old client was to a previous old server, right?
Not necessarily. Like say the course of which you're rolling this out, right? Like you roll out your brand new server, it has this feature in there, and then you take the off the box existing version of Relay or Apollo client and you point it at that server and say, hey, pull down the types and let's get to business. It will tell you that you have to do things a certain way that the server then tells you is illegal.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I think that if we were to go the directive route, all of the fields would be nullable, like as a requirement of a tagged, what should we call it? A one-of, right? Of a one-of type, all of the fields should be nullable. And then what one-of is saying is that all of them shouldn't be present except one, and that one that is present must not be null. But that's a new requirement, right? Old clients would just look at it in the introspection, they wouldn't see that nuance. So they would just see 3 nullable fields. So they wouldn't see that as all of them being required. They would see it as all of them being optional. If they were to send that to an old server that had implemented that same schema, the server would raise an error if you didn't specify exactly one in a resolver. What the new server would do is do the same thing, but as a validation rule. And that's really the only change. So the error that you get back would be located at a different position in your GraphQL. Maybe it's composition? Yeah, it would, because you wouldn't have a partial success. You'd have a validation error. But other than that, it would be very similar. Like you would either succeed because you gave something that would have been valid against the old server and is still valid against the new server, or it would fail because it wouldn't have been valid against either.
Maybe we'll have to write these out in the thread after the call, but it seems to me that there's still some potential problems there. Maybe I don't understand the way you're explaining it, but
Yeah.
I can envision a scenario where I say, npm install relay. I pull down this introspection from my brand new server that supports this, and I end up in a position where I can't get either relay to compile or the server to accept my query if a schema is written in a particular way. That has nothing to do with like an old schema that has been upgraded to use this feature. It's just like purely about what software has been released that people are using. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to use a new kind of type. I'm trying to boot back into my brain the reasons why we followed that path. It presents its own set of concerns, right? Like an existing type or an existing client might not be able to even use these new tag types because it'll be like, it has no idea what they are. So
I really hate that the Zoom chat trims all the leading spaces. It's very frustrating. So I'm going to use one of here on an argument, which isn't something that we've spec'd previously. But in this case, you can imagine that there's a user field on query. We've tagged it as one of. Now, imagine that one of isn't there. That's an existing valid schema where you're saying, I want to find a user either by their ID, their username, or their email, right? And existing clients could use that. They might specify more than one, in which case the server either picks one or it goes, you give me two of them, that's not valid, and it throws an error. It gives them none of them, in which case the server goes, well, I don't know what to do. It either is going to return null or it's going to throw an error. Or you give it one, in which case it's going to go off and get that one record by whichever of those you gave. Now with the one of there, it just adds a validation rule so that new smart clients know I have to provide exactly one of these, but old clients wouldn't notice that it had one of and would just treat it the same as they always did. So I don't see it introducing an issue here, assuming that the server worked in that way.
Here's a quirk, right? For both clients and servers that understand the syntax and meaning of one of, does this imply that the by ID argument in this particular case is actually a required non-nullable field in the situation in which that's the argument you provide?
Yes.
And so adding this directive mutates not just the type, but it also mutates the types of all the fields.
Yes, it effectively says, depending on which one you give, that one must not be null. So yeah, it effectively turns it into a union of objects where each one is by ID required, or by username, string required. It's effectively turning it into a programming union, not a GraphQL union. But obviously we don't have modeling for that. But yes, that's what it would do. And yes, it is a diversion from what we currently have. But I think it is one worth entertaining.
Cool. I much now better understand what you were trying to explain. It makes sense. I suspect that might cause downstream complexities in how the spec text is written, but it seems like it should work.
Okay, so a bunch of us have to head out soon. So what are the next steps that we're ending with?
Great question. So I don't think that at the end of this, I don't think that any of the other solutions have pushed themselves to the forefront and made tagged irrelevant. But I also am not convinced, I don't want to go ahead and start trying to finalize the tagged spec, because at the moment, my gut tells me that the original plan, the old directive, the slight tweak to the introspection plan is actually probably the best plan. It's the easiest plan. It's also the most flexible. It can influence the most parts of the schema, and it's the easiest for all of the maintainers of the various GraphQL clients and implementations to implement. So for me, that is the leading option. So I'm keen to know if there is general consensus on that, or how we can get to general consensus on that, or have someone say it's not going to work because it breaks this, or it's not going to work in this particular language because they have this feature that isn't compatible with that or something, which is outside of my wheelhouse. But yeah, like if there's a reason that we cannot go that way, I'd like to know it. And if everyone thinks that actually that route's quite good, then I'm certainly open to reviving that old PR and also opening, extending it potentially to definitely arguments and potentially output types as well. But I think that one probably should be a separate follow-up PR. Like, I'll show that it's possible, but I don't think we'll actually like merge it at the same time, would be my gut feel there.
Yeah. To Andy's point, like, I think if we wanted to go that route, we need to at least see that PR and also talk about what it means for existing unions. But I think that's probably a future path that works, but we need to walk down that a little bit before we can be comfortable with it as a solution.
I think we need to go down on the spec level details to figure things more. Like the things you talked with Lena about is especially these, suddenly this becomes non-nullable for all things if it's provided things. I think these are the details we need to look at.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm just going to have a quick glance at the original one field directive pull request to see if it's still in the shape that I think it is.
I do think it's worthwhile to, even if later, if we decide to chop it up and do it for inputs only, I do think it will be a worthwhile exploration to have a directive that you can apply to input types, output types, and arguments, since those are the three use cases that have all kind of come up as similarities. I suspect you might be able to copy a lot of the work that you put into the tag type RFC, because most of this is about whether it manifests as a new kind of type or whether it manifests as a property of an existing type. Arguments will be new, but you know, the fact that there's like a validation step, that should probably be the same in both. My hope is that it yields something that is simpler, because you don't have to litter around or this new tag type thing in so many places. But I'm curious to see if there are also some cases where it gets more complicated because of this like backwards compatibility with existing types situation, and like its effect on requiredness and nullability.
Mm-hmm. Well, from a quick glance, which obviously I can't read it in depth whilst on the call with you guys, it looks like the spec that I opened is in line with what I think it was in line with. And given it's been about a year since I last looked at it, I think it's okay. So do by all means have a look at that. That is only spec'd so far for the input type, but I think that's valuable, and you can imagine that that would extend quite easily to arguments, because arguments and input fields are very similar in general. Extending it to output types, I think, is probably a little bit more work. But yeah, by all means, have a look at that. The fact that it is exposed in SDL as a directive is kind of irrelevant. It could just as easily, as Lee said a number of times, just be that I put one of in front of the word input instead. And also, I've called it one field in this pull request, but there has been push to potentially call it one of rather than one field. And I think one of actually would make more sense, especially if we're applying it to arguments. So I'm well up for that. So just replace it in your head with one of. But broadly, I think this is the way that I'm leaning at the moment. So I guess it's on you all to have a look at that again, refresh yourselves, see if you can come up with any issues with it. And it's on me to literally refresh the pull request, probably reopen it again. and add the arguments and potentially the output objects to it.
Yeah, I have a question. I still feel like can be benefits to evolving per field, like one group, basically. The stuff that I presented maybe like maybe with custom syntax. I still like custom syntax. So the question for that is understand I shouldn't compare it against all other like alternatives. So the question here is like if we have enough compelling use cases where it's beneficial and what are the benefits against one of applied to entire type, right?
Yeah, so I think my one-of proposal would always apply to an entire type, or in the case of arguments, to the field that has the arguments. I considered making it a per field thing and then doing grouping. And as both you and Lee agree, like having multiple groups of one-offs doesn't really make sense. To me, having one group of them doesn't make sense if you can't have many. So where I went down that path is it actually doesn't make sense to me to have one or many of them. It just has to be everything is one field. There is no additional fields in there. That's where I landed on that, and I understand that your position on that differs from mine, Ivan, and that's that's welcome. Diversity is good. But yeah, like I won't be proposing that. My one-off will always propose that it affects the entire type or the entire list of arguments.
Definitely think that's simpler, and it aligns with the advice Evan gives to his crew of if you want something that has this polymorphism, then you punch down a level and you do it there. Which is probably not the best in terms of data modeling simplicity, but it's certainly an improvement in terms of data model complexity at the schema design level.
Another thing, like part of this thing is that I'm kind of like, from public standpoint, the fact that we add like something like input union polymorphism as a directive is kind of like weak in a sense. It looks like we ourselves not sure that it should be used.
Yeah, I think ultimately we will put a syntax on it. I'm not sure how that syntax would work for arguments, but honestly, your syntax of using the caret in front of each of them, that would be the same thing. Like that would be fine. It's just a syntactic expression of it. The fact it's exposed in SDL as a directive is irrelevant. The main thing is, just like with deprecation reason, it's implemented as a field in introspection. That's like the GraphQL thing is there's a field in introspection. How we expose it through SDL, like there is so many. If you actually have a look through, I think we discussed it on previous input union working groups, and we went through all the different syntaxes that it could have. Well, a few of them, not all of them, because I didn't come up with your one. But yeah, there's a lot of flexibility there. I agree. I think we should do it as a keyword rather than a directive. But if we do it at this point as a directive, then it's smaller spec edits. And then later when we decide that this is the route we want to take, but the syntax is wrong, then we can change it to syntax, which is a little bit more work.
But we'll never delete in that case. We'll always start with the directive.
Sorry, Ivan, I didn't hear any of that.
I mean, like in this case, if we first add directive and when we add custom syntax, we cannot remove directive from a spec. If we ever
We'll only approve one version. Yeah.
I'm not proposing we merge it as a directive at this point. I'm just saying during the development of it, if I can put a directive there, I don't have to add a whole bunch of information to the spec to say I'm allowed to do this, because directives are already allowed. It just makes my job a lot easier, means we can jump to seeing if it solves the problems first before we worry about how it tastes.
Maybe call this out directly on the PR also for other people, that this is not a syntax focused discussion, but more like a semantic implications PR, if this makes sense, and that the directive is more like a vehicle to discuss it. Just for other people who are not on the scope.
Yeah, I have a feeling that that's already been highlighted in that particular thread, but I'll be opening this up as a new pull request, and I will definitely be sure to make that point.
Put it in the title, no new syntax, just people don't read text, they read only title.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but overall, I think that's a great step, I must say. Like, I'm really looking forward to it.
I have to jump into another meeting, but thanks for putting this together, Benji. I know we've kind of bounced around a bunch, but I feel like this conversation has been super valuable.
It's
We've
been
got
super
a
valuable.
solid
for me,
direction.
definitely.
Cool.
Thank you all for giving me your time. I really appreciate it. And enjoy
Thank
the
you
rest
very
of your
much,
day.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.